Margaret Hartwell was 53 years old when she walked into Clearwater Bay with nothing but the clothes on her back and $42 folded in her coat pocket. Her brother Thomas had cast her out 2 weeks earlier, dragging her carpet bag to the cottage door and telling her that a woman who would not marry and therefore could not contribute to the Hartwell name had no claim on the family inheritance or the farmhouse she had managed for 31 years. She had nursed their mother through the consumption that took her. She had kept the accounts, repaired the fences, raised Thomas's children while he courted, and married a banker's daughter whose dowry had tripled the property. None of it mattered now. The deed was in his name alone. The land was his. The $42 was what remained after she had sold her mother's silver hairbrush and the pearl brooch her father had given her on her 16th birthday. She had nowhere to go, no family willing to claim her, and no prospects but the poorhouse or a domestic's position in some house where her age would make her less valuable than a sturdy young girl. That was when she saw the boat. It lay in a cradle at the far end of the harbor, abandoned and listing, its hull painted in flaking green and its masts stripped bare. The harbor master, a man named Cobb, who had known her father decades before, told her it had belonged to a failed fisherman, that the owner had died of a fever 3 years past, and that the vessel was being sold for salvage. She could have it, he said, for $40, and the satisfaction of hauling it away. Everyone in town laughed when she told them she had bought it. A woman alone, half her fortune spent on a sinking boat. But Margaret knew something they did not. Sealed somewhere within that degraded hull lay a mystery that her grandfather had taken to his grave, a secret that would either condemn her to ruin or restore to her what the world had stolen. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Hartwell. If you've ever felt discarded by those meant to cherish you, or watched others ignore the value in what lay before them, tell us in the comments. Margaret's grandfather, Samuel Hartwell, had been a man of contradictions. He was Margaret's father's father, born in 1794, just as the Republic was learning to walk on its own legs. He had come to California in 1851, during the fever of gold, not as a prospector, but as a merchant. And he had done something that men of that era rarely did. He had kept meticulous journals. Margaret's father had shown her these books once, when she was a girl of 10, spreading their worn leather volumes across the parlor table and reading passages aloud in his deep, measured voice. Samuel had not struck it rich in gold, but he had struck something rarer. He had documented the era, the people, the prices, the moral reckoning of an industry built on suffering. He had written about the Chinese laborers he employed, the wages he paid them, while others enslaved their kind. He had written about the gold he had recovered, yes, but also about the decisions he had made to use some of it to build a school in a Mexican settlement inland, to fund a doctor's practice, to leave seeds for a future that would belong to more than the wealthy few. Her father had told her that Samuel's later years had been spent in a different endeavor entirely. He had become obsessed with preservation, with the idea that moral wealth, the story of what a single person could do, the evidence of justice practiced in an unjust time, might matter more than gold itself. He had retired from commerce and taken to fishing, an unusual choice for a man of means. But he had said to her father, just once, that the ocean was a place where a man could think without the corruption of ambition clouding his mind. When Margaret's father was born, Samuel had already begun to retreat from the world. He died when Margaret's father was still young, and the journals had been passed down, revered but rarely read. Margaret had grown up on stories of her grandfather's strange wisdom, his refusal to compromise his principles, even when compromise was profitable. She had learned from her father that integrity was not a luxury. It was a foundation. Her mother had reinforced this with quieter lessons. The way she tended to the sick without expecting payment. The way she treated a laborer's wife with the same courtesy she showed to the banker's spouse. These were not dramatic virtues. They did not make a woman wealthy or famous, but they made a life worth living, and they made a daughter who would remember them even when she had been discarded like old furniture. The fall had come swiftly, though Margaret supposed it had been falling for years, in ways she had not wanted to see. Her mother died in the winter of 1887, and the household shifted. Thomas's wife, Eleanor, had never hidden her belief that Margaret was an obstacle to the family's advancement. Without their mother to temper her, Eleanor began to make small cruelties into policy. Margaret's meals were served last and coldest. Her room was given to a visiting cousin. Her opinions on the management of the household were met with laughter and dismissal. She bore it because she had nowhere else to go, and because she had been raised to believe that suffering in silence was its own kind of dignity. But there was dignity, and then there was erasure. When Thomas announced his intention to sell the farmhouse and move to San Francisco, where Eleanor's father had promised him a position in his banking concern, Margaret understood that her time was finished. She had asked for nothing but a small allowance, enough to rent a room in town and perhaps find work as a seamstress or a companion to an elderly widow. Thomas had refused. The move would be expensive. Every dollar was needed. She was a capable woman. She would find her way. Did she not have friends? Could she not write to distant cousins? His tone suggested that he genuinely did not comprehend that he was condemning her to poverty, that he saw her only as an inconvenience finally being resolved. Eleanor had not bothered to hide her satisfaction. Margaret had packed her bag in silence and left on a gray afternoon in late March, taking only what fit and what belonged to her outright. She had sold what she could. The hairbrush and the brooch had fetched $18 at a pawn shop in the next town. A widow whom she had helped nurse had insisted on giving her $20 as a parting gift, a kindness Margaret still thought about in the dark hours before dawn. That was how she had accumulated $42. It was not much. It was everything she had. The fishing boat, which had once been called the St. Anne, lay in the cradle, as though it were resting from a long battle. Margaret saw it on her second day in Clearwater Bay, wandering the waterfront in a state of numb shock, trying to decide whether she should seek work at the cannery or risk the shame of the poorhouse. The harbor master, Cobb, had mentioned it in passing, not expecting her to listen. She had returned to examine it more closely, running her hand along its weathered hull, seeing in its decay a kind of kinship. They were both abandoned. They were both at the end of their usefulness. She had asked how much, and when he said $40, she had felt something break open inside her. Not despair, but a kind of reckless clarity. She had nothing. She might as well have nothing in a boat as on the streets. She had paid the harbor master the next morning, and he had signed over the papers, looking at her with an expression that mingled pity and confusion. Her first night aboard the St. Anne, Margaret had worked by lantern light, moving through the small cabin and the cramped hold below deck, assessing what she owned. There was a galley stove, intact but rusted, a narrow bunk with a rotted mattress, a captain's table with 2 chairs, coils of frayed rope, a compass that no longer held true, and in the corner of the hold, behind a loosened panel of wood, she had found a leather satchel. It was her hands that recognized it first, before her mind could catch up. The leather was the same that bound her grandfather's journals, that particular texture and grain that suggested Mexican workmanship, quality that lasted. Inside the satchel were 3 objects: a brass key, small and ornate, that she had never seen before, a sheaf of letters tied with string, their envelopes marked with her grandfather's handwriting, and a map, not of the gold fields, but of the coastal towns, with a particular area marked in red around Clearwater Bay itself. Margaret's heart had begun to race. She had spread the letters carefully on the captain's table and read them by lamplight, her eyes growing wider with each page. They were dated 1888, written in her grandfather's unmistakable hand, though her grandfather had been dead for 23 years. The dates did not make sense until she read the first paragraph of the first letter, which was addressed to her father. "My dearest son, if you are reading this, I am gone. I have left these letters in the care of Captain Addison Rourke, a good man, and the only one I trust with this burden. He is to seal them in the hold of his vessel, the St. Anne, and they are to remain there until a member of our family truly needs them. The key you hold opens a box buried near the old oak at Clearwater Point. What is inside is not treasure in the way the world measures treasure, but it is something that I could not leave in the hands of those who would exploit it. Read carefully. The secret is in the ledger." Margaret had set the letter down with trembling fingers. Her grandfather had written this for his son, expecting it to be found, but not by Thomas, not by anyone with greed in their heart. He had encoded his message in the ledger he mentioned, a book that she had never seen in all her research into his life. She had rifled through the other letters, searching for clarity, and found instead more questions. Her grandfather had recorded names, Chinese laborers who had been promised good wages and paid fairly, Mexican families given loans without interest to purchase their own land. The doctor in the inland settlement had been funded for a full decade, his work detailed in precise script. But the final letter was different. It spoke of a betrayal, someone close to the family. Her grandfather did not name them, only referred to them as the one who came after, had begun to appropriate his legacy, claiming credit for his charitable work, suggesting that it had been motivated by pride rather than principle. Her grandfather had written that he could not fight this theft during his lifetime, that his son would understand the nature of the theft once he read the ledger, and that someday, when someone of the family returned to Clearwater Bay in genuine need, they would find what he had hidden. He had written, "I trust that Providence will guide them to the truth." Margaret had kept the key and the map close to her body for 3 days before she decided to look for the buried box. She had told no one what she had found. The town of Clearwater Bay was small enough that secrets had a short lifespan, and she did not know yet whether what she had found would make her a target or simply mark her as mad. She walked to Clearwater Point on a morning when fog rolled thick off the water, obscuring the cliffs and the white rocks below. The old oak was impossible to miss, a gnarled giant that must have been old when her grandfather was young, its trunk twisted and scarred by storms, its branches spreading like the fingers of a protector. She found the spot 3 feet from its trunk, marked with 3 stones arranged in a triangle, arranged in a way that looked natural, unless you knew to look for it. The ground gave way to her spade more easily than it should have, suggesting the earth had been disturbed before. that someone had been here, perhaps recently, checking to ensure the box remained undisturbed. The brass key opened a locked strongbox buried 2 feet down, wrapped in canvas and preserved in a manner that suggested careful planning. Inside was a book, not her grandfather's journal, which she knew well, but a different ledger entirely. This one detailed financial transactions, but not in the way she expected. Her grandfather had documented every act of generosity he had performed in his later years, but he had also documented the response of his family, particularly one family member who had begun to appropriate the credit, to mention in letters to business associates and society pages that it was he, not her grandfather, who funded the school, who paid the doctor, who ensured that the settlement had a bridge and a market. The ledger named names. It documented the amounts. It provided evidence that was irrefutable. Her great-uncle Harrison, her grandfather's brother, had been systematically stealing the moral authority that Samuel had built through a lifetime of quiet justice. Harrison had died in 1872, but his son, Margaret's cousin Robert, had inherited both the business and the false legacy. And it was Robert who had encouraged Thomas to move to San Francisco, who had suggested that the farmhouse was a liability, who had whispered that Margaret was a burden. Robert, who had built a reputation in California society as a man of principle and philanthropy, riding entirely on the back of his grandfather's work and taking credit for his uncle's grace. Margaret had understood then why her grandfather had hidden the ledger. Exposing such a betrayal during his lifetime would have served no purpose but revenge, and revenge was not what Samuel Hartwell had been about. But leaving the evidence for someone who truly needed it, someone who had nothing left to lose, that was a different calculation. That was faith. That was a grandfather saying to a distant descendant, "When you are at your lowest, the truth might be your only weapon, and I am trusting you to know what to do with it." She had returned to the St. Anne, with the ledger and the key and the map, and she had begun to think about how to proceed. The answer came faster than she expected, in the form of a letter. A week after she had claimed the boat, a man came to the harbor looking for her. His name was Samuel Prescott, and he was a journalist who had recently arrived in Clearwater Bay to research the history of charitable work in California during the gold rush era. He had been interviewing old-timers, collecting stories, and he had heard Margaret's name mentioned in connection with her grandfather. He had sought her out, hoping she might have access to Samuel Hartwell's papers. His politeness and genuine curiosity had disarmed her initial caution, and she had invited him aboard the St. Anne. She had not shown him the ledger immediately. Instead, she had listened to his questions, understood his purpose, and then asked him one of her own. What would he do if he discovered that someone prominent in California society had built an entire reputation on false claims, on stolen moral authority? Prescott's eyes had sharpened. He was a man who understood what truth was worth. He had told her that he would tell the story, and he would tell it in a way that could not be denied or hidden. Margaret had then brought out the ledger, and she had watched his face as he read. When he finished, he had looked at her with something that resembled reverence, and asked her how she had come to possess it. She had told him everything, about her grandfather's letters, about the buried box, about the St. Anne, and the key. She had told him that she did not want personal revenge, but that the truth deserved to be known, that the families who had benefited from her grandfather's actual generosity should know their benefactor's real name, and that the institutions he had built should understand their true founder. Prescott had promised her that within 3 months he would publish a comprehensive article in the San Francisco Chronicle. Within 6 months, he said, the story would reshape California's understanding of its own charitable history. But there was a complication. Robert Hartwell, Margaret's cousin, had also come to Clearwater Bay. He had arrived angry and suspicious, drawn by rumors that Margaret had found something valuable. He had confronted her at the harbor, demanded to know what she had in the boat, and suggested that anything belonging to the Hartwell family belonged to him. He had tried to obtain an injunction, claiming that Margaret had stolen property from him during her eviction. He had told the local magistrate that she was unstable, that she was squandering money she didn't have on a worthless boat, that she might be a danger to herself. The magistrate, influenced by Robert's standing and his promises of investment in the town, had begun to look at Margaret with suspicion. She had begun to understand that she might not have the luxury of waiting for Prescott's article to run. If Robert could convince the magistrate that she was unfit or that the boat contained stolen goods, he could seize everything. It was Cobb, the harbor master, who had warned her. He had come to the St. Anne one evening and told her that Robert Hartwell was offering money to anyone who could prove that Margaret had stolen valuables from the Hartwell family home. Cobb had also told her something else, that he had known her grandfather, briefly, that Samuel had once helped him when he was young and desperate, had loaned him money without interest to purchase a small boat, and that the kindness had changed the trajectory of his life. Cobb had offered her protection and advice. He had suggested that she not wait for vindication to come to her, that she should take what she knew and do something with it immediately. He had suggested that the right story, told to the right people at the right time, could accomplish what no amount of legal maneuvering could. And then he had told her something that changed everything. There were other families in Clearwater Bay and the surrounding towns who had benefited from her grandfather's generosity over 40 years ago. Some had used the opportunities he had given them to build good lives. Some had become teachers, merchants, farmers, people of standing. They had never known the true source of their good fortune. They had believed, as the world had told them to believe, that it came from Robert Hartwell, or from divine providence, or from their own cleverness. Cobb had given her a list of names. Margaret had spent 2 weeks visiting these families, carrying with her the letters her grandfather had written, and excerpts from the ledger that Prescott had copied. She had gone to the school teacher who ran the academy that her grandfather had funded. She had gone to the doctor's wife, whose husband had since passed, but whose practice had trained 3 other physicians. She had gone to the shopkeeper, who had purchased his store with a loan from Samuel Hartwell, a loan that had been forgiven when Samuel realized the man was struggling, a generosity that had allowed the shop to grow and thrive for 40 years. She had told them who they truly owed their gratitude to. She had shown them the documentation, and she had asked them to bear witness to the truth when it was published. By the time Robert realized what was happening, it was too late. The article had already gone to press. The story of Samuel Hartwell's genuine philanthropy, the documentation of Robert's theft of credit, the names of the families who had benefited, the moral accounting of a man who had believed that justice mattered more than wealth. It all appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on a Tuesday morning in June. The story spread like spilled water. Within a week, it had reached Chicago. Within a month, it had appeared in newspapers across the country. Robert Hartwell's reputation collapsed overnight. The institutions that had celebrated him began to ask uncomfortable questions. His business partners distanced themselves. The society pages, which had once been full of his name, fell silent. And then something unexpected happened. The families whom Samuel Hartwell had quietly helped, the ones who now knew his true name and his true nature, began to gather. They organized a formal dedication of the school that bore his name. They funded a scholarship in his honor. They began to tell his story not as a historical curiosity, but as a moral exemplar. The doctor's widow donated her husband's journals to the city archives, framing them as the work of a man trained by a physician, funded by Samuel Hartwell's generosity. The shopkeeper established a merchants' association dedicated to fair wages and ethical practice, naming it the Hartwell Collective. The truth, once released, generated its own momentum. It built something that money alone could never build, a legacy of principle. Margaret had not sought reward for what she had done, but reward had come to her nonetheless. The families whose ancestors she had vindicated, the institutions that now knew their true benefactor, the community that had been restored to its proper moral history, all of them had offered her assistance. Cobb had hired her to work as a harbor master's assistant, paying her a respectable wage and asking her opinions on matters of harbor maintenance. The school teacher had offered her a position teaching history, using her grandfather's journals and the story of Samuel Hartwell as a foundation for a curriculum on ethical leadership. The doctor's widow had offered her lodging in a cottage near the harbor, rent-free in perpetuity. She had accepted the position with the school and the lodging, and she had declined the others, not out of pride, but out of a desire to remain independent. She had enough now to live with dignity. She had enough to know that she had not misread the world, that the principles her parents had taught her were still true, that justice, though delayed, was not impossible. She had kept the St. Anne. She had not repaired it immediately. Instead, she had allowed it to rest in the harbor, the way it had rested when she found it, as a monument to the moment when her life had changed. Eventually, Cobb had helped her restore it sufficiently to float, and she had sailed it once, just once, out into the bay and back, moving through the water as though the boat remembered how to carry a person toward hope. She had understood, in that moment, that her grandfather had known something that most people never learn, that the cheapest-looking things often contain the greatest value, that what is discarded by one generation might be exactly what another generation needs, and that a life lived with integrity, even a life that seemed to end in obscurity and loss, could still speak across time and reshape the world. In the end, Margaret's story was the story of her grandfather made manifest. She was the one who needed what he had left behind. She was the one whose need made her trustworthy enough to carry his truth into the world. She did not become wealthy from the ledger or the letters. She did not become famous, though her name appeared in some historical accounts as the woman who had preserved Samuel Hartwell's legacy. But she became something that mattered more. She became a person who understood that being cast aside can, paradoxically, be a form of grace. It removes the ambition that corrupts. It removes the need to protect what you have. It leaves you only with the truth and the question of what you will do with it. Margaret had answered that question by doing the only thing a woman of principle could do. She had told the truth, and she had trusted that it would be enough. She had walked into Clearwater Bay with $42 and an entire lifetime of quiet preparation. She had purchased a sinking boat and found within it not treasure, but something better. She had found her place in a story that had been waiting for her for half a century. A story that belonged to her grandfather, but that could only be completed by her own courage and her own choice. The boat, that decrepit vessel that everyone had laughed at, had become the vessel that carried redemption, not for Margaret alone, but for everyone who had ever been diminished by lies or forgotten by history. So we leave Margaret Hartwell as she was on the day she was offered the teaching position, standing at the rail of the St. Anne, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of copper and rose, understanding at last that her grandfather had been right all along. The ocean was a place where a person could think without the corruption of ambition clouding the mind. It was a place where an old woman with nothing could become exactly what the world needed: a keeper of truth, a restorer of names, a witness to the fact that integrity, if it is truly practiced, echoes longer than any fortune ever could. Thank you for being here, for listening to stories of people who were overlooked and discarded, only to find that what they carried inside them was exactly what their communities needed to remember. If there is a person in your past, someone whose name deserves to be spoken again, whose generosity deserves to be known, will you tell us about them in the comments? And as you move through your week, keep this question close. What is a time you found yourself in possession of something others had written off, only to discover that it held unexpected value? Until next time, stay close,